I can't stand you anymore, Arthur. My daughter-in-law Lauren screamed from the front door of my son Daniel's house, her voice echoing across the suburban street where neighbors were walking their dogs. Pack your things and get out. This is my home and I don't want you here. And don't come near Evan again, she added, her voice dropping to a cold whisper that carried more threat than her shouting. I don't want you confusing him with your old-fashioned ideas about how children should behave. I was standing on the porch with my overnight bag when Lauren decided that her father-in-law was no longer welcome in her family, or Evan's life. Dad, just give us space, Daniel said weakly from behind Lauren, unable to meet my eyes. We'll call you when things calm down. And Dad, don't call my work anymore. Don't show up at school events. Just stop. She didn't just want space. She wanted me gone before Evan's next appointment. She wasn't kicking me out of a house. She was cutting me out of Evan's life. 15 minutes after Daniel invited me for Evan's birthday, Lauren was throwing me out like I didn't belong in my own family. Lauren, what's wrong? I asked, genuinely confused by her sudden hostility. 3 months earlier, she'd been calling me the best grandfather Evan could ask for. The same porch where we'd celebrated Evan's first steps, and where Lauren had once thanked me for being the father figure she'd never had. Lauren wanted me gone from Evan's life like I was a disease that needed to be quarantined. You know exactly what's wrong, Arthur, she continued, her arms crossed, her voice getting shriller with each word. The way you interfere with our parenting, the way you undermine my authority with Evan. Evan's been acting different lately, and you're making it worse by giving him conflicting messages about behavior. If you've ever been erased from your own family for asking the wrong questions, you'll understand what I did next. In that moment, I heard my late wife Eleanor's voice. Arthur, if Lauren ever tries to separate you from Evan, you remember exactly who you are and what you're capable of protecting. I understood that something had changed in Lauren's attitude toward me, but I had no idea why. What she didn't know was that I'd spent my whole life around kids, and I knew when a child was being managed instead of loved. Lauren thought she'd successfully banished a harmless old grandfather who'd quietly disappear from Evan's life. She had no idea what I was capable of when a child's well-being was at stake. It had really started 6 weeks earlier, when Lauren began making comments about establishing clearer boundaries with extended family. 6 weeks before the porch confrontation, Lauren had started suggesting that my visits were disrupting Evan's routine and that she needed more control over family influences. During a family barbecue, I watched Evan play alone while Lauren explained her new family management philosophy to Daniel. Evan needs consistency in his discipline structure, Lauren told Daniel. Having different authority figures confuses children his age. When she mentioned that experts recommend limiting conflicting family influences, I noticed Daniel nodding reluctantly. Arthur, you let him get away with things I wouldn't allow, Lauren added. It makes my job harder when Evan thinks he can manipulate different adults. The way she said manipulate made it sound like Evan was running a con game instead of being a normal 7-year-old. Was this really my family? When did my relationship with Evan become something that needed to be managed instead of celebrated? Later, while washing dishes, I realized what was happening. Lauren wasn't establishing boundaries. She was establishing control over every aspect of Evan's relationships. Most people would have confronted her directly, but something in me chose to stay quiet and observe Evan more carefully. That day I said nothing about my concerns, but I'd already started making mental notes they knew nothing about. Lauren didn't realize I noticed everything. I'd always been careful about child welfare, always kept detailed observations, always understood how to recognize when children were being isolated from supportive family members for reasons that had nothing to do with their best interests. The conversation that changed everything happened 4 weeks before the porch confrontation, when I found Evan's medication bottle in the bathroom during a visit, a prescription I'd never heard Lauren mention. Methylphenidate for ADHD, Evan M. Johnson, age 8. Take 1 tablet daily for focus and attention. Daniel was working late most nights, and Lauren handled all the medical appointments and pharmacy visits. The refill sticker showed it had been renewed twice, and all the insurance notifications went to Lauren's email. Evan wasn't calmer. He was gone. That's when I started listening more carefully to Lauren's phone calls about managing Evan's behavioral issues. The medication is helping with his focus problems, Lauren was saying to someone in the kitchen, but his grandfather keeps questioning why an 8-year-old needs ADHD medication. I stayed in my car, knowing exactly what kind of conversation this was. This wasn't medical consultation. This was narrative control. Dr. Martinez agreed that Evan shows clear signs of attention deficit disorder, Lauren continued, reviewing what sounded like medical documentation. The prescription should help him concentrate better in school and be more manageable at home. I recognized the pattern immediately. Something about Lauren's coordination with medical professionals felt designed to justify behavioral control rather than address actual medical needs. Arthur keeps suggesting that Evan just needs more outdoor time and less screen time, Lauren said with obvious frustration. He doesn't understand that modern children need professional intervention for developmental challenges. When I'd met Dr. Martinez during that one appointment, he barely looked at Evan. He looked at Lauren's notes. Lauren is just stressed, Daniel said when I questioned Evan's lethargy during a weekend visit. Evan's been hard to manage lately. The medication helps him focus at school. But Evan had never shown signs of attention problems when he was with me. He could focus on building projects for hours. He could read entire books without distraction. He could complete complex puzzles that would challenge children much older. They weren't treating Evan's medical needs. They were medicating away his natural personality to make him easier to control. That day I pretended I hadn't overheard anything, but my investigative instincts had captured every detail of their scheme. But what I discovered next would change everything. That evening, I sat in my study and began documenting everything I'd observed about Evan's behavior during our visits over the past 6 months. As someone who'd spent nearly 4 decades watching children develop and identifying when family dynamics were harming their emotional growth, Evan's energy levels had decreased significantly. His natural curiosity had been replaced by listless compliance. 3 months ago, he'd ask me, "Grandpa, can we build the rocket again?" Now he just sat quietly and said he was too tired to play, and the school nurse said one sentence that made my blood run cold. Evan asks me every day if he can skip his medicine because it makes him feel sick. Evan exhibits attention deficit symptoms requiring pharmaceutical intervention, I'd heard Lauren tell Dr. Martinez during a phone call. His grandfather's influence disrupts his medication routine and creates behavioral regression. Arthur's old-fashioned parenting philosophy conflicts with modern child development science, Daniel had added in conversations I'd overheard him having with Lauren. Professional intervention is necessary to help Evan develop appropriate social behaviors. They've been researching medical justification that would give them complete authority over Evan's development while eliminating anyone who might question their methods. They weren't treating Evan. They were building a story around him. But Lauren had miscalculated something crucial about her target. What she didn't know was that I'd seen this before. Kids labeled a problem when the adults were the problem. I pulled out the notebook I'd been keeping since Evan's personality changes began. Detailed observations of his behavior patterns, energy levels, emotional responses, and physical health during visits with me versus visits at his parents' house. 6 months of documentation. Every behavioral change, every medication side effect I'd noticed, every conversation Evan had shared about feeling foggy and tired all the time. Every instance where his natural personality emerged when he was away from Lauren's controlling environment. By the time I finished reviewing everything, I realized the truth. Lauren wasn't treating Evan's medical condition. She was creating one to justify controlling every aspect of his childhood. Eleanor would never forgive this betrayal of Evan's well-being. What they also didn't know was that I'd already contacted my longtime pediatrician about concerning medication patterns in children who didn't meet legitimate ADHD criteria. Lauren made her fatal mistake when she assumed I would simply disappear from Evan's life because she demanded it. Instead, I'd spent 4 weeks documenting Evan's condition while building my own child welfare case with evidence they'd never suspected I was collecting. Evan's not going to lose his grandfather because Lauren wants complete control over his development, I'd told my longtime pediatrician, Dr. Williams, who'd treated Daniel during his childhood. But Lauren doesn't need to know I'm building a medical evaluation file. What Lauren didn't know was that I'd spent 39 years as an elementary school principal, which meant I understood child development, family dysfunction, and educational manipulation better than she realized. They thought they were dealing with an interfering old man. They forgot I'd spent 4 decades identifying when children were being harmed by family members who prioritized control over well-being. Dr. Williams looked at me across his office and said quietly, "Arthur, what you're describing isn't medical treatment. It's child abuse disguised as mental health care." Lauren's parenting strategy had become a systematic attack on Evan's natural development and emotional health. The evidence stacked up quickly. Lauren had collaborated with medical professionals to create documentation that contradicted Evan's actual behavioral patterns, but she'd made procedural errors that any experienced child welfare advocate would identify immediately. The ADHD diagnosis doesn't match standard evaluation protocols, Dr. Williams confirmed. Dr. Martinez's assessment seems based more on parental reports than clinical observation. Lauren had attempted child manipulation against someone whose career had been devoted to protecting children from exactly these schemes. Anyone who's ever worked with children knows exactly why I kept fighting for Evan's well-being. I knew Lauren's scheme was finished when Dr. Williams contacted the state child welfare services. "Arthur, we've identified concerning patterns," social worker Karen explained during our meeting. "Excessive pharmaceutical intervention, isolation from supportive family members." I kept asking myself, when did Lauren start seeing Evan as a problem to be medicated instead of a child to be nurtured? I spread evidence across Dr. Williams's desk, my documentation of Evan's behavior patterns, Lauren's correspondence with medical providers. "This represents systematic child abuse," Dr. Williams noted, "creating false disorders while isolating children from questioning family members." What sealed Lauren's fate was discovering Dr. Martinez had been prescribing similar medications to multiple children whose parents wanted easier management. They were hunting for Evan's compliance, but I was hunting for Evan's protection. That was their first mistake, but not their last. The state medical board is demanding a full review of Dr. Martinez's pediatric cases, Daniel mentioned during a panicked phone call, his voice tight with anxiety. They're investigating his ADHD diagnoses. Evan overheard one of their arguments when they thought he was sleeping. "Mom, why are people asking about my medicine?" he asked Lauren. "The lady at school said someone wants to know if I really need it. The whole medication plan is collapsing." I overheard Lauren telling someone on the phone late one evening. "Arthur's pediatrician is questioning Evan's diagnosis. If they determine Evan doesn't actually have ADHD, we could face child welfare charges." What confirmed their complete panic was when they decided to ban me from seeing Evan entirely, hoping to eliminate the one person who could testify about his natural behavior. The night before Evan's welfare hearing, I sat in my study reviewing the comprehensive evidence file that would expose Lauren's child abuse scheme and protect Evan's development permanently. I pulled out Eleanor's final letter, written during her last week in hospice care. "Arthur, if anyone ever tries to harm Evan or control his spirit the way some parents tried to control children in your school, you remember that protecting children was your calling. Use everything you learned to keep Evan safe." The evidence revealed calculated manipulation that transcended parenting concern. Lauren had been planning to medicate Evan into compliance while eliminating anyone who might recognize his actual developmental needs. Lauren's scheme represents systematic child abuse involving pharmaceutical manipulation, social worker Karen had explained during our coordination meeting. Unnecessary medication, isolation from supportive family, conspiracy to suppress natural child development. Some school principals spend their careers understanding exactly how child abuse works and how to protect vulnerable children from family members who prioritize control over well-being. Tomorrow, Lauren would walk into that hearing, thinking she was defending her parenting decisions. She didn't know she was walking into a comprehensive child welfare investigation. What she also didn't know was what Evan had told me during our last supervised visit about how the medication made him feel like someone else was living in his body. The confrontation came when Lauren, Daniel, and Dr. Martinez met with Child Welfare Services expecting to defend Evan's ADHD treatment plan as necessary medical intervention. Evan's behavioral issues require consistent pharmaceutical management, Lauren began, settling into her chair with obvious confidence. His grandfather's interference with medication schedules creates developmental regression that undermines our treatment protocols. The ADHD diagnosis is well documented and professionally verified, Dr. Martinez added, presenting medical files for treatments Evan had never actually needed. Family members who question pediatric medication often lack understanding of modern child development science. I looked at them calmly from my seat beside Evan's court-appointed advocate, the same advocacy system I'd worked with for decades when protecting students from harmful family situations. Before we discuss Evan's medication, social worker Karen said quietly, there's something important you should know about your child abuse investigation. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out the comprehensive evaluation report Dr. Williams had prepared, placed it on the conference table between us. The independent developmental assessment showing Evan had no signs of ADHD. The medical licensing board's report documenting Dr. Martinez's inappropriate prescribing patterns. The child welfare investigation file proving Evan's medication was medically unnecessary. Lauren, social worker Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper, you forgot that Evan's grandfather spent 39 years identifying when children were being harmed by adults who claimed to be helping them. Lauren's face went completely white as she read the child welfare documentation. Mr. Arthur, what is this? Daniel's voice cracked as he picked up the developmental evaluation. When did Evan get evaluated? How could he ask me that after watching his son become a shadow of himself under Lauren's pharmaceutical control? The medication regimen you imposed contradicts Evan's actual developmental needs, I continued. The ADHD diagnosis you obtained was based on fraudulent parental reports rather than clinical necessity. That's impossible, Lauren snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. Dr. Martinez is a licensed pediatrician. He wouldn't prescribe medication Evan doesn't need. And I've been working with child welfare services since Evan first started showing signs of pharmaceutical suppression. Dr. Martinez tried to gather his fraudulent diagnostic materials, but his hands were shaking too badly to manage the paperwork. Evan sat quietly beside his advocate, finally understanding why he'd felt so strange for so many months. Child Welfare Services was already preparing their official intervention plan. But there's one more thing you should hear, I said, turning to Evan. Evan, do you want to tell them how you feel when you don't take your medicine? What finally ended their scheme was the moment Evan described feeling like myself again when I took him camping, and Lauren forgot to send the pills she claimed were essential for his well-being. Justice came quietly when Child Welfare Services opened a formal investigation into Lauren and Dr. Martinez 6 weeks after Evan's hearing. Both faced child endangerment charges and professional review, with Lauren's parental rights under court supervision and Dr. Martinez's medical license under investigation. The state has determined that Evan was inappropriately medicated without sufficient medical justification, the social worker announced. Dr. Martinez is under review by the medical board, and Evan's custody arrangement requires supervised parenting classes. Dr. Martinez's practice was suspended pending investigation. Lauren's parenting required court-ordered supervision. Evan was placed in temporary custody with me, while Daniel attended mandated family therapy sessions. 3 months later, Evan was running around my backyard without pharmaceutical suppression for the first time in over a year. We sat on Eleanor's garden bench, watching the sunset over the neighborhood where Daniel had grown up. Grandpa Arthur, I feel like myself again, Evan said quietly, his natural energy and curiosity returning day by day. Why did Mom want me to take medicine that made me feel so tired and sad? Sometimes adults make mistakes about what children need, I told him. Your grandmother always said that children should be loved for who they are, not medicated into who adults think they should be. I wish Eleanor had lived to see Evan choose playground adventures over pharmaceutical compliance. Sometimes the quietest justice comes from simply remembering who you are when others choose to forget. Lauren calculated that her elderly father-in-law would be easy to banish from Evan's life, but she'd forgotten the most important detail about her target. When Lauren told me, I can't stand you anymore, she thought she was eliminating an interfering old man who questioned her parenting authority. She didn't know I understood child development better than she understood pharmaceutical control. My investigation wasn't what she expected. My investigation was justice served through proper child welfare channels, systematic documentation, and complete protection of the grandson Eleanor and I had raised to be curious, energetic, and wonderfully himself. She tried to erase me from Evan's life. Instead, she erased herself from his future. Evan got his laugh back, and Lauren learned the hard way. Some grandfathers don't disappear. We document.